Hey guys, it's Isaiah Thompson here with DailyClout, and I'm going live to talk to you guys about something that's big in the news right now, and something else that's maybe not so big in the news right now. I know there's not a lot of people on yet, but I'll get going so that those that are watching after this live video can just get right into it. Don't have to wait long. So, as everyone knows, the Trump administration has implemented and is thinking about implementing. I think it's about what 200 billion dollar more tariffs on China. So this is a trade war that's been ongoing. These newest tariffs will be, an addition to the ones that are already passed on soybeans and on steel. So this trade war, and China is also thinking of retaliating in kind with their own tariffs. So we have essentially a trade war going on here because of the Trump administration's policies. And I want to talk about first the recent study that came out. This came out of the Netherlands. Recent study says that the effects of the Trump administration's tariffs and their trade policy most likely won't be felt until around the year 2030. That's super interesting. So I think this is really important to think about because, in the long arc of history, when we think about the modern era, trade is something that's very, much a long-term policy area. You don't feel the effects of economic trade policy very quickly. It takes a while. It takes a while for prices to increase, and it takes a while for inflation to really kick in if it's going to for certain products in certain industries, and for the consumer to get those effects and for everyone to kind of feel it. It takes years down the line. So I like to think about if you look at trade and history of America in the modern era, over time we are moving towards what most economists believe to be the economically sound option, which is freer trade. Everyone's not in agreement that free trade is, the best possible option, and many of us have a lot of concerns about free trade and exactly how workers are being treated in these when within these free trade agreements between countries that don't have as much money and workers that'll work for lower hours, and wages are low and the conditions are bad, and we have many of these concerns, but economists mostly agree that freer trade is better economically for both sides because for various reasons, which we're not going to go into. That's not really the topic of this. But what I do want to say is that because economists believe that we will end up eventually moving towards more progressive, more free trade, there isn't a big, alarm going off about tariffs because eventually you have economic stability. You have a homeostasis where the economies of both places kind of level out and the policies and trade war ends, and that's eventually going to happen. I think everyone can agree that we're not going to be in a long forever trade war with China. No one thinks that. Even within the Trump administration, we can see things happening that are kind of going against the really divisive policies. For instance, Congress, I actually talked about this last week, but Congress has taken about, there's a few products like steel products, some food products, irons, and some chemicals that they're actually taking the tariffs away for China. So they're lessening the trade restrictions on China, which is clashing with the Trump administration's policy for China, which is interesting. So there's still, even as it's happening, while the trade war is going on, there's still some righting of the ship, sort of, when in terms of trade policy. And we also can look to the fact that it's just going to be it's mostly a very optimistic kind of policy area. You don't see big trade wars happen for long periods of time because countries don't like them. People in the countries don't like them, and voters don't like them. So there's something else that's going on right now in Congress that has been in the news all year that is really a big area of contention, much like trade, but I don't think it has the same positive outlook that trade has, and that's why I chose to talk about it today. So On July 24th, after the Trump administration announced their $12 billion tariff on China for soybeans. There's also that same week, we had a big debate going on in Congress about the Farm Bill. Now, many people talk about the Farm Bill and have an idea about what it is and what it isn't. It's very convoluted policy. Definitely. It's definitely not an easy thing to read if you tried to read it. I'm gonna include the link to the Farm Bill that's being talked about right now. It's a long document, and mostly most of the people who know about it are people that either have a stake in it, farmers and insurance salespeople, and those that hate it. So for everyone else, I'm going to break down the Farm Bill because I think despite the fact that tariffs and trade policy have a really positive long arc of freer trade, it's not really something that seems like it's going to go back down to the dark ages of trade. The Farm Bill hasn't changed much since its inception. And I want to go over that with you guys and get into that very quickly. So, for the most part of about 80 years, the federal government has been sending checks to farmers. The initial implementation of the farm subsidies was actually extremely necessary, and I want to go over a little bit of the history here. It was mostly a reaction from the Roosevelt and the Hoover administrations from drops in farm prices. So this happened because of the Dust Bowl and also the Great Recession that those politicians said we have to do something to help farmers. And when you look at it, farming was so much of a huge part of the economy and well ingrained into it. Everyone was 40, I believe it's about 40% of Americans were living in a rural area, and a large percentage, it's 20% of the labor force, actually worked on farms in the 1930s. So you can kind of see contextually why it was such a huge deal and why it was important to start these policies. So I like to definitely have a little profile for one of the biggest proponents of the farm legislation, and that was Henry A. Wallace. He was kind of Roosevelt's farm bill architect. So he was this kind of very interesting character. You should read about him if you don't know much about him. Like this meditating, very early proponent of civil rights, and he was the Secretary of Agriculture, turned vice president for Roosevelt. So he knew that it was an economic necessity, but also very politically popular for the reasons that I mentioned. And it's worth noting that fresh out of college, he was actually helping direct agricultural policy through his father, who was Secretary of Agriculture. That's Henry A. Wallace. So Wallace wrote in the Wallace Farmer, which he was also the editor of, which was a journal specifically made for farmers. And he regularly kind of was against tariffs, which is kind of funny because it's still relevant today. He was a farm guy who was against tariffs. At the time, the Smoot-Hawley tariff was the big tariff that a lot of farmers were against, and he actually said, that he wanted to hammer on the stupidity of American foreign trade policies. I'll put a link in the description for some of this, and he saw that the tariff was a cause of the depression in many ways. So today we find that the Republican Party allowing great trusts to use tariffs for price fixing purposes is some of the same things that he was going through then. And while his stances on many issues held up to the test of time, his foreign policy, I think it could be seen as very outdated. So he had the federal government purchase surpluses and implement price controls as were necessary to keep farmers afloat during these very hard times. The Depression, difficult times, you've got crops dying. People are not buying crops because they don't have the money anymore. So not only is it that people can't afford the food, they have all these crops and the food's dying. All their crops, their grain, it's all dying and it's just laying there. You're sitting there, what am I going to do with this? So you have to obviously give subsidies to these farmers so people can still get food and they'll still ship it out and they'll still stay afloat because food is important not only for just for the economic reasons but for national security reasons. You need people fed. It's very important, and it actually became very important during World War II as well. And uh, he had a lot to do with that. So I like to start on kind of an update on what's going on with foreign policy by just a quick excerpt from David Wessel's Red Ink, which goes over the budget, but it has a really nice section on foreign policy. So, federal government has been sending checks to farmers for good times and bad, and this began with the disastrous drops in farm prices in the late 20s and the 30s. As I said, it's with Hoover and Roosevelt. So, the big farms have considerable clout, and they use these temporary farm subsidies to live on, accounting for about 15 billion in federal spending every year. About a third of the money comes in direct payments, no strings attached, checks that the government sends to farmers. This is today still. Like many other benefit programs, farm subsidies are hard to unravel, a maze of payments, loans, and insurance that bewilders everyone except those people that benefit from them. Farm Bill also includes a unique mechanism that forces Congress to act. If it doesn't pass the bill that arises every 4 or 5 years on time, or extends the last one temporarily, the clock is turned back, and the government's payments to farms are based on unusually high crop prices of 1910 and 1914 adjusted for inflation. To me, that is the most maybe outrageous sticking point that this bill includes. That we're still basing those off of crop prices from back then, obviously taking inflation into account. And the price of food does not cost the same in America as did back then, especially with the increased trade, which you can see these two are very, very tied together. There was kind of a relationship there. So, I mean, this thing is a 600 page worth mix of insurance for things like milk and grain, and it has payments straight to the farmers, which is crazy if you think about no strings attached payments from the government. I mean, that's something that there's almost, I can't name another benefit plan that has something like that where you just get the money shipped out to you. That's interesting. And this is a type of legislation that really takes a long time to do. Usually there's a lot of fighting about when it's getting done, and there's always someone who's kind of fighting to end the subsidies. And I don't think that's what we should take away from an understanding of this farm bill. There aren't many calls for defunding it. There are some, but it's clear that stabilizing agriculture is important for the reasons we talked about. National security, feeding, making sure people are fed, and there can be emergencies and other things that make having a strong agricultural sector important. Having said that, there are common sense changes that should be made. Definitely, I think everyone can agree on that we need to update this and actually look at it and think about it. So I like the American Enterprise Institute's report on the recent farm bill and some of the things they had to say about it. And let's just some of their prescriptions seem like reasonable things. I want to know what you guys think about it. Please comment in the comments on what you think about the changes that they would like to see for this huge bunch of money that's just pretty much just sent down to farms and um, not really thought about much every year. So they published a report in 2017, and they think that rules like taxpayers shouldn't be paying for programs that incentivize the government to dump food, which is something that can happen with the Farm Bill. Um, that's pretty straightforward. Instead of funneling money to insurers and wealthy farmers, the AIE report argues that economically sensible strategy is to instead increase funding for public investments in agricultural research and development, and that shifting the bill policy to an investment strategy is more than political rhetoric. At the very least, Congress should update the prices and payments based on the early 1900s, which makes sense. So there's this idea that we need to try and definitely upgrade how we think about spending this money and get a better ROI on it. Um, the other big thing is that farmers today are not just the mom and pops of the 1920s and 30s. There aren't these downtrodden, there are many hardworking farmers out there, don't get me wrong. But most of today's farm industry is built off these very large industry farms that make up less than 1% of the population's workforce. So, large farms with, by huge companies that are sitting here and, raking in farm bill dollars. We need to rethink if that's the best bang for our buck. Small town farmers, who are just, they're working hard every day, and we want to make sure that they're safe and that their farms don't go out of business. That's important. We should support those farmers. But we do have to think about how this money is being spent. And R&D is something that's very important. There's so many. It's just so interesting when you read about farming progress and technology and the different ways that we have learned to, you know, go very far off very little in terms of seeding and the way we actually work the land. And we do need to actually invest in this. This is important. Food's important as population grows and we want to feed more people. We want to be able to sustain this. So I think this is a super important policy to pay attention to, so that we don't want to be wasting money on corporate farms when we definitely could be using it in a much better way elsewhere. And you don't want to waste money anyway in government, because there's so many people and so many places where we do actually need a lot of funding for things, and it's important to look at how we're using it. I think that's a thing that everyone agrees with. It's not really it's a bipartisan thing to say that we should be spending money and putting money where it should go. So I just thought that was really interesting, and amidst the whole big conversation about this, huge tariff war between Donald Trump's administration and China, that we maybe think about something that's probably not going to change. Farm Bill hasn't changed much since the 30s, but maybe it should. What do you guys think? That's all I got for you this week. So please tell me what you guys think about the Farm Bill. Tell me if you have any opinions on how that money is spent, and maybe if you're a farmer out there and you have a different outlook on it, I'd love to hear that too. So, it's Iziah Thompson at DailyClout, and it was fun talking to you, and I will see you guys for our next video. That's all I got this week. Thanks a lot. Please, if you like this kind of content, go to our website at dailyclout.io, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel here, so we can keep bringing you guys great content and keep actually having conversations about things and not just, throwing on